Early Experimental Psychology, Part 2, Herman von Helmholtz, Psych 182, History and Systems, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno, Professor Michael Bauman. Welcome back to the History of Psychology. I'm Dr. Bauman. In this unit, we're going to talk about Herman von Helmholtz. He was one of the most important scientists of the 19th century, and his work spanned physiology, sensation perception, and physics. Super smart guy. In fact, he came from modest means and was working off the cost of his medical degree by serving in the German army. His research was so important that the army let him leave his appointment 2 years earlier so he could move on and take a professorship at a university. Now, he was a pronounced anti-vitalist. This is something that he strongly believed in. And he had a group of like-minded fellows in grad school, and they all swore an oath never to consider vitalist causes. Some scholars of psychology say it was a blood oath. We don't know that for sure. He was primarily a reductionist, as you'll see as we go through. He was also, depending on who you read, an empiricist, because he's interested in the senses as they enter the body and how the sensory data are processed. Now, his first major claim to fame was in studying something that had become a major idea scientifically at the time, and that's the notion of the conservation of energy. And I'm sure you've all heard this one before. It's the idea that matter cannot be made or destroyed. Helmholtz applied that idea to energy and basically said that when we consume something, whether it's oxygen, whether it's food, none of that is lost. We use that food, we use that oxygen, and it's converted to other things. Here's a physical example of conservation of energy. Simple example. It's nice for a simple-minded example once in a while. You throw a ball down the lane and you hit the pins. Energy is transferred from the ball to the pins. If you've ever bowled, you know that when the ball hits the pins, it slows down. It may move a little bit to the right or left, but now the energy that was in the ball is knocking down the pins. That is, of course, unless it's me bowling, where the energy is transferred from the ball to the gutter. Helmholtz's first major contribution was the demonstration that food and oxygen consumed could account for the total energy the organism expended. So if you eat something and then take a nice long walk and you look at how many calories were expended, they might be equal to what food you've consumed. And we all know the problem with consuming too much food and not expending that energy. You get, like me, you get fat. Here is that idea. And it was a really important scientific idea at the time. But for me, the idea that I'm most fascinated with Helmholtz for is his notion of neural processing and the speed of neural processing. Now, the neuron you see here is a rat neuron, and you're seeing essentially 1 millisecond of electrical pulses moving through that neuron. The camera up at UC Berkeley took 1,000 pictures a second to get to that side and get that movement in the neuron. Kind of pretty, isn't it? It takes time for neurons to send information from one part of the body to the brain or vice versa. Previous estimates of neural processing were all over the place. In fact, some individuals thought that neural transmission was instantaneous. The most modest pre-Helmholtz estimate was 9,000 million feet per second to the outrageous 57,600 million feet per second, which I think somebody calculated is actually faster than the speed of light. Well, Helmholtz found that the speed of neural processing was a rather dismally slow 50 to 100 feet per second. Now that's still really fast. It's just not as fast as the other estimates. Think if you were a runner and you did the 100-yard dash and you were going 100 feet per second, you finished in 3 seconds. That'd be pretty good, wouldn't it? How did Helmholtz figure out how fast neural processing worked? What he did was he took a frog and he stimulated the frog's leg at different points with an electrical neural stimuli. And he would stimulate the nerve by shocking it at one point and then measuring the reaction time. Then he would make a second shock at a lower point in the frog's leg and get a different reaction time. Now, there was one major problem that Helmholtz found with his reaction times, that they weren't very stable. In fact, some people had faster, well, excuse me, I didn't tell you this. Helmholtz also later did the same neural processing studies on humans, found out that you would get different reaction times with both animals and humans at different times of day in different environments. And neural processing wasn't a static thing. It really varied from individual to individual and also within individuals. You might say Froggy found that shocking, but it's all stuff that has to do with the brain, and that does as well. Come on, pop your second eye out. Yeah. Well, the main thing that Helmholtz is remembered for as it relates to psychology is his study of sensation and perception and how that worked. So let's define some of these terms. Then I will tell you how he applied it to visual stimuli and auditory stimuli. So, sensations in Helmholtz's system are the raw elements of consciousness. They are simply the sensory information that moves along neural pathways to the appropriate part of the brain. Now, sensations turn into perceptions, and they're given meaning by the experience we've had, and also by the past experiences we've had. Now, Helmholtz was an empiricist. Kind of unusual for a German, since most of the rest of them were rationalist. But he developed an idea that's an intriguing idea called unconscious inference. And basically what he's saying is that perception may be mitigated by experiential information that you don't even realize you're reacting to, and as represented by the senses. So if I look over and I grab my coffee cup here, I sense it's a coffee cup because I've seen other coffee cups before. The sensations match other things I've seen. Now, I went into my copy of good old Boring's History of Psychology. This is it. This is the very first history book in psychology. I'm lucky enough to have a copy I got from a used book sale for a whopping 50 cents. Far more valuable to me than that. So, Boring says several things about what Helmholtz believed unconscious inference was. And the first we've talked about already. Perception is mitigated by experiences we've had in the past, even if we don't realize, and this is the unconscious part, that we're using that experiential information. And he says we can't help it. This is another part of the unconscious thing. He says it's, to quote Boring's translation, irresistible. And these inferences can't be corrected by the conscious mind. Kind of freaky, eh? I think it's kind of a very unusual way of looking at things. But we've learned something, and since he's an empiricist, we may as well go back to Locke and say you wrote something on that slate, and when you need it to perceive something, you recall that slate, and you do it so quickly you don't even realize you're doing it. Which leads us to the last point of unconscious inference in Helmholtz's system. He says our unconscious inferences are formed by experience. They start out as being conscious, and by continually having associations with other senses and other stimulation and repetition, they become unconscious. Cool idea. Well, let's apply that. Well, not necessarily apply it, but let's talk about two different things of many things that Helmholtz studied. And one thing he developed was the trichromatic theory of vision. This is oftentimes called the Helmholtz-Jung theory of trichromatic vision because Jung developed this much earlier than Helmholtz did, but it kind of sat around until Helmholtz again independently discovered it, and it became popular. For Jung, the idea came a little bit before its time. So what Helmholtz found, and that we know is true today, is that we have three different cones in our eyes to perceive color. We have red, green, blue, sometimes called violet. Every color we see that isn't one of those three is a blend of those three colors. Helmholtz actually got the idea going way, way back to Newton, where Newton was breaking white light up into rainbows with his prisms. So, he believed that neurons fire in reaction to specific stimuli. And every color that we sense or perceive are some combinations of red, green, and blue. Now, to the left of me here is a picture of the color spectrum that goes all the way from Y rays to radio waves. Notice that little tiny bit there. That's the red, yellow, green, blue, kind of rainbow colored area. That's the small area of light that we pick up as humans. I've seen some fascinating work with ultraviolet lights and what, for example, butterflies see, because butterflies can sense light waves in the ultraviolet range. Interesting thing to look at. Now, here is a couple of more slides I stole from my old intro psych book. So you can see we have the three color receptors. I've repeated that to you, so you should have those pretty much down. You can see that color mixing happens. So for example, purple is equal amounts of red and blue color receptors, but a little less green. If all of the cones are firing at the same rate, or being stimulated at the same rate, we should say, you get gray. And then finally, for after images, when you see a bright light, oftentimes you have an after image. A lot of times that's a little bit of red and green, and depending on what sensation you hit, if the blue is exhausted, you see kind of this yellow after image here. So, color vision is Helmholtz. If you think about it, we still talk about this today. In the old days of computers, when we were moving from monochrome to color monitors, we used to talk about getting an RBG monitor. For a while, in the 80s and 90s, there were these big box projection TVs, and they would have these red, green, and blue discs on them, and the colors would mix in. And even on today's modern LED screens, the pixels are set to fire in combinations of red, green, and blue, and depending on the number of pixels and saturation and all kinds of other stuff, you oftentimes hear TV manufacturers advertise about the millions and millions of colors you can see on their television. Now, here's another thing to think of before we move to audition. Helmholtz studied under Mueller. Remember Mueller from our last video? Mueller came up with the doctrine of specific nerve energies. What Helmholtz is showing is that even within a certain sense receptor like the eye, you have specialized neurons with their own specific nerve energies. So it's kind of cool. He's building on Mueller's work. He did the same thing with audition. And he looked at hearing and audition, and he made the discovery that there were different fibers in the ear that corresponded to the perception of different frequencies. So here is a picture of the cochlea stretched out in a human ear. Usually it's kind of like a snail-like critter looking in there. Well, it's not a critter, it's an apparatus. And you can see by this picture that different parts of the cilia are different lengths, almost like a harp, and they respond to different frequencies. This is an even more dramatic application and extension of Mueller's doctrine of specific nerve energies. So, Helmholtz, very important guy, made some very unique discoveries. I'm always fascinated by the nerve conduction stuff, but he's one of the most important scientists of the 19th century, and he essentially lays out the basis for many areas that we'll study in psychology once it formally is founded. So, that's it for this video lecture. Hope it hasn't been too shocking for you. We'll see you next time in the history of psychology. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020. Professor Michael Botwin, all rights reserved.